The last method of factoring that we will review is factoring quadratic trinomials. Quadratic trinomials are in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c, where a, b, and c are numbers. Previously, you may have learned different methods to factor quadratic trinomials. We are only going to be reviewing one of them today. We are going to review the method that always works. Again, this method works with all quadratic trinomials, as long as they're factorable. Okay, to start, let's look at number 1. 5x squared plus 11x plus 2. The first thing I recommend you always do is identify a, b, and c. A is the coefficient of the x squared term. In this case, a is equal to 5. B is equal to the number that's along with x. In this case, we have b is equal to 11. And c is the constant, so here we have c is equal to 2. Once we identify a, b, and c, we want to multiply a times c. For this problem, a times c would be 5 times 2. 5 times 2 is equal to 10. Alright, once we end up with the number 10, that's what we're looking for, we want to find the two factors that multiply to equal 10. And the same two factors that multiply to equal 11. I'm choosing 11 because 11 is the b term. So we want the same two factors that add to equal b. You will want to go through all factors of 10. This should be an easy one. Factors of 10 that add to 11 will be 10 times 1 and 10 plus 1. So we have our two factors. Now let's come back over here. I'm just going to draw a bracket around this. This is extra work. You always want to have it, but it is extra. And we're going to start back looking at the original polynomial. Originally we have 5x squared plus 11x plus 2. Now we will rewrite this with a new middle term, 5x squared. Instead of 11x, we will now write plus 10x plus 1x. I got this from our factors over here. Okay, so far we have 5x squared plus 10x plus 1x and also the constant plus 2. Once we have our polynomial rearranged or rewritten, we want to factor by grouping. So this should seem similar to everyone. Group the first two terms, group the second two terms. In the first two terms, we have a GCF of 5x. When we factor out 5x, we are left with x plus 2. In the second two terms, we have a GCF of 1, and we have to write 1 because it is part of our answer. So plus 1, and we're left with x plus 2. We want to double check. Do we have common factors? We have x plus 2 here, we have x plus 2 here, so yes we do. Come down a little further. Our final answer, x plus 2 for our common factor, multiplied by 5x plus 1. 5x comes from here, 1 comes from right here. And that's it. Again, our final answer is, in parentheses, x plus 2 multiplied by 5x plus 1. Okay, let's now take a look at number 2. I'll repeat myself. In the past, you may have looked at a different factoring method for a problem like this. That is fine if you know how to do it, but in class today, we are using the same factoring method for all problems. Okay, to start with, we need to identify our A, B, and C values. For A, because we don't see anything with the x squared term, we know our value of A is 1. The value of B is 11, and C is 24. Once we have A, B, and C, we want to multiply A times C. A times C would be 1 times 24, which is equal to 24. We now know that we need to find two terms that multiply to equal 24 and the same two terms that add to equal 11, or whatever the value of B is. So in this case, 11. Okay, so think about all our factors of 24. We have 6 and 4, they do not add to 11. 8 and 3, 8 times 3 is 24, 8 plus 3 is 11. So there's our factors, 8 and 3. Okay. Next step, rewrite our original polynomial, x squared. Instead of writing 11x, we write plus 8x plus 3x plus our constant of 24. To repeat myself, 8x plus 3x can be combined to equal 11x. We did not change anything, we just rewrote our original polynomial. Now we can factor by grouping. Group the first two, group the second two. The first two terms have a GCF of x. We will be left with x plus 8. The second two terms have a GCF of 3, positive 3, and we'll be left with x plus 8. Double check to make sure you have a common term. X plus 8 here, x plus 8 here. Looking good. So your final answer will be, in parentheses, x plus 8 multiplied by x plus 3. And you're done. To check your work, distribute first two terms in the first set to both terms in the second set. Okay, moving on to number 3. My first thought of number 3 is that it looks a little more complex than the other ones we've worked with. First, I want to note that there is a negative coefficient. So back to the first factoring method of factoring by the greatest common factor, we always want to factor that negative sign out. Right there, that negative sign. All right. I also notice that all of my coefficients have a common factor of 2. So not only are we going to factor out a negative, but we will factor out a negative 2. So we're doing this before we even start factoring the trinomial. If we factor out a negative 2, we are left with positive 2x squared minus 13x minus 7. And be very careful with your signs here. We're factoring out a negative 2. Because it's a negative, you're going to essentially flip all your signs. So again, be careful with that. Alright, now that we have this as a trinomial, we are going to focus on what's inside of the parentheses. We now need to identify A, B, and C. A is equal to 2. B is equal to negative 13, and C is equal to negative 7. Here we multiply A times C. In this case, that would be 2 times negative 7. 2 times negative 7 gives you negative 14. Negative 14 tells us that we need to find the two factors that multiply to negative 14, and the same two that add to negative 13. So take a second and think of these factors. 7 times 2 is 14. That doesn't work. 14 times 1. 14 times 1 works, but we need to pay attention to signs. We want to have negative 13, which means our only option would be negative 14 times positive 1 to give you negative 14, and negative 14 plus positive 1 to give you negative 13. Those two factors work. So the next step we want to do is look at, again, we're looking at what's only inside the parentheses, but we want to rewrite that part. We start with 2x squared, that stays the same. Our middle term, negative 13x, is now going to be minus 14x plus 1x minus 7 for our constant. Okay, now factor by grouping applies. We're looking at the first two terms and the second two terms. For our first two terms, our GCF is going to be 2x. That leaves us with x minus 7. For the second two terms, our GCF will be positive 1. That leaves us with x minus 7. So for our final answer, we need to make sure we remember our GCF. We're going to bring this down. So our GCF of negative 2 factors back in. We have x minus 7 as our common factor, right here. And we have our two GCFs, 2x plus 1. And they come from here. Your final answer, negative 2 multiplied by, in parentheses, x minus 7 multiplied by 2x plus 1. All right, last one. This one also looks a little bit different. We have x squared minus 16. If our form is ax squared plus bx plus c, this problem does not fit into that equation. It appears that we are missing our bx term. If that is the case, you can always add your bx term in. You make sure that x has a coefficient of 0. What I mean by that is we have x squared. We want to add bx in, so we write plus 0x. Remember that anything times 0 is still 0, so we are not adding anything of value in. We are basically writing a placeholder, so it makes it easier to factor. We now have x squared plus 0x minus 16. Following the same steps as before, identify a, b, and c. A is 1, b is 0, c is negative 16. Now we multiply a times c. That is equal to 1 times 16, or negative 16, which is equal to negative 16. That negative 16 tells you that you want to find two factors that multiply to equal negative 16, and the same two factors that add to equal 0, your middle term, your b term. The factors are going to be negative 4 and positive 4. Negative 4 plus positive 4 gives you 0, exactly what we want. Next step of our process is to rewrite our quadratic. Bringing this down, we have x squared minus 4x plus 4x minus 16. Negative 4x plus 4x does not change the value. This adds to 0, which was our original bx. So we're all set. We are ready to group. Group the first two, group the second two. Looking at the first two terms, we have a common factor of x. That leaves us with x minus 4. Looking at the second two factors, we have a common factor of positive 4, and that leaves us with x minus 4. We have two common factors. That tells us to write them as one factor, x plus 4, multiplied by x minus 4. And x comes from here, plus 4 comes from here, and then the common factor. We are all done. The final answer, in parentheses, x plus 4 multiplied by x minus 4. For this last problem, x squared minus 16, some of you may be familiar with sum or difference of cubes. If you are more than welcome to use it, but once again, I'm only going over one factoring method, the method that works with everything.